to be here, to get back to this wonderful place with all of you who have decided to travel throughout the world and come together and talk about ways in which we can defeat counterterrorism. Now, a lot of the presentations that you hear today are focused primarily on the academic side of counterterrorism, the ideas and the motivations and some of the strategies that you can use. I come from the world where it's really about the nuts and the bolts and, frankly, the dollars associated with counterterrorism efforts and their effectiveness. And so I'm going to talk about essentially what the mindset is of the place you don't really hear about from a global perspective, but what has become the front lines of counterterrorism, at least from the United States perspective, and that is state and local government. Now, you might be wondering, why the heck am I wearing a hard hat? Because I did my research. And I know that 5 years ago, a presenter who was standing here was hit on the head by a bolt that fell from one of the lights, a small bolt. So I figured, I'm not going to have that risk. And I'm going to put on the hard hat. It's a minimal cost for a minimal benefit. What's wrong with that? Kind of silly, huh? So then why, 5 years after Richard Reed tried to light his shoe on fire and detonate it on a plane, does the United States still require that all air passengers take off their shoes? And only the United States. And I'll tell you why. It is something that a lot of people don't necessarily get a chance to appreciate. And that's because the United States, as many governments are, is a reactive government. We have been accused of fighting the last war, of preparing for the last attack. And in many regards, that is accurate. After 9/11, the United States had to wake up to a threat that was, yes, asymmetrical, but was no longer either conceptually or practically a threat from overseas. The war of terrorism came home. And so automatically, overnight, what you had was the deputization, if you will, of the first responder in every home, town, and village in the United States. And this was expected to be done immediately, with no real concern about the costs associated with that effort. Make sure it doesn't happen again. So we set forth in trying to develop what I refer to as the two sides of the Homeland Security coin: the hardware and the software. The hardware being the gates, guards, guns, and gadgets of Homeland, and the other side being the planning, training, and exercising. And the goal was nothing less than to make every firefighter, every sheriff, every deputy someone who could respond and hopefully prevent a terrorist attack. And as we all know, the great lessons of war is that when you try to protect everything, you wind up protecting nothing. I entered into this drama in 2002 when Secretary Tom Ridge appointed me to a task force to examine how money flowed from the federal government down to the state and local governments. And what became very apparent very quickly was that those levels of government, though they were good at providing electricity and water and social services benefits, were completely out of their league when it came to protecting their citizens from a threat that they could not predict. And so we have spent so far $11 billion to a sector of the governmental economy that we'd never seen before. A mobilization of local assets and resources without a strategic plan. And when you consider the ramifications, just some numbers for you. In the United States, there are 17,000 law enforcement agencies, 30,000 fire departments, 15,000 emergency operations center, 5,500 hospitals, and 80,000 county and parish governments. Many of those, in addition to receiving the Homeland Security dollars, also have the ability to raise their own dollars through taxation or the levy of fines and fees, which gives them, to a large extent, the autonomy to develop the systems that they believe will protect their population. That is also the bad news, because with that autonomy comes absolutely no uniformity. And what the Department of Homeland Security in the United States has really struggled to do is to first decide what is the capability that you should have for places like New York City or places like Selma, Alabama. What is the threat that you're going to be looking to try to prevent, react, and mitigate? And at the end of the day, when the money begins to lessen, though I don't see that happening really anytime soon, who will be left to continue the safety? As you heard from my background, I was in politics for a long, long time. And one thing I know is that once you give your constituents a service or a benefit, it is enormously difficult to take it away. You do so at your own peril. So what has become apparent also is that the strategies that we need to protect the population of a place like the United States reside, to a great extent, in the private sector. Now, many of the technological solutions that are available could, in fact, add enormous value to the attempt to protect the population. But what I've also discovered is that the world of the Defense Department, the world of the security agencies, are not in a position to take what they usually do for the purchase of an F-16 and bring it down to the purchase of a first responder notification system. When the federal government considers a military apparatus, they have all sorts of test beds, they have all sorts of agencies to measure and to evaluate the efficacy, the cost, and the benefit of that particular product. Not so for the Homeland Security device. The Department of Homeland Security has created an agency called the Science and Technology Department, S&T. And they work on a military-style model of evaluation. The difficulty is, so much of the innovation comes from smaller companies from around the globe, particularly right here in Israel. But yet, because of how cumbersome, lengthy, and costly that process is, it really leaves it to the larger companies who come from the defense world and try to apply it to the Homeland Security field. The difficulty there is further compounded in that local governments, states and counties, are not used to working with the major contractors, defense contractors, who've now turned their energies towards Homeland Security. And so what you have also is this gap where the new companies who are coming into this space don't really know what the benefits of their particular system would be and what the needs are of a local government. They also don't know the funding stream. I had, in my last position, all sorts of people coming in to sell me something. And they would walk into my office and, failing sales 101, they wouldn't have done any research on what my problems were that needed to be solved. They wouldn't have done any comparative analysis for what their solution did as compared to other solutions, and they could never tell me how I was going to pay for it. So what it did was it left me in the position of having to do that footwork if I wanted to integrate their technology. Well, I assure you that in the hectic days of a state government the size of New York, you don't have a lot of time sitting around the pool eating bonbons. It is an incredibly hectic pace. And so when you have to go and do that, it becomes actually a factor that works against the integration of that technology. But even if you have the opportunity to integrate those types of technologies, oftentimes there are difficulties that are very hard to predict. Let me give you 3 examples. One of the, if you go back to Boaz's discussion this morning, he talked about radiological threats, chemical threats, and biological threats. Well, these are all low probability, high impact events. We all know that. Well, this is what happens when you try to implement solutions. Several years ago, by statute, the United States Congress created the Domestic Nuclear Detection Office, DNDO, and for several years has appropriated $40 million for that agency to basically set up systems by which they could detect either a nuclear or a radiological device entering into either seaports or a city. In New York, this program was piloted through a program called Secure the Cities. And essentially it's a ring deployment that is designed to basically push out the barriers for detection so that should something come in, they'll pick it up. A part of the plan was to provide local law enforcement with certain detectors that could do a standoff detection. And they were going to give it to police officers, including the state police, which I oversaw, to go in and basically drive around and see if they couldn't find a car that had some radiation signature. A couple of problems. Obviously, you have to train the law enforcement personnel on how to use this technology. But secondly, given the availability of nuclear medicine, so oftentimes as you're driving down the road and you get a hit, it's someone who's had a barium series. Now the question becomes, under New York penal law, how do you stop them, detain them, with no suspicious behavior? We had to work through that. But from a more practical perspective, having spoken with a Rockland County sheriff, Rockland County is just north of New York City, but it was a part of this process. The police officer said to me, "So, you know anything about that program?" I said, "Yes, actually, I sit on the advisory board, and what do you think? It's a pretty good program, right?" He says, "Well, I don't really know." I said, "Well, why? Do you have a lot of false positives?" He says, "I don't know." I said, "Why?" Because all the machines you've given me, they're in the closet in the police headquarters. I said, "Excuse me?" "Yeah, they're in the closet." I said, "Why?" He goes, "Because I'm very concerned about a nuclear or radiological device getting into New York City, but I'm also concerned about drunk drivers. I'm also concerned about car thieves. I'm concerned about drug traffickers. And that is the day-to-day responsibility of a police officer." And so the ability to integrate law enforcement personnel who have a day job into the strategic implementation of what should be a very, very important, if not a number one priority mission, is very doubtful. Another instance, biological weapons. In recent House testimony, several members of the 9/11 Commission have testified that they believe that the deployment of a biological weapon will happen in the next 5 years. And if you go through the testimony, you'll see that the number one agent that they refer to is anthrax. Many of you may have read literature on this. Anthrax is more easily handled and more easily developed than, say, other chemical weapons. It doesn't necessarily have to come from a munition, and can be homemade, if you will, given certain laboratory requirements, and is effectively aerosolized and therefore speeding dispersal. There are companies that produce an anthrax vaccination. In a recent regulation, the Department of Homeland Security Secretary has mandated that first responders, particularly police officers, firefighters, and emergency personnel, be vaccinated. Because if there is an anthrax event, like the United States suffered in 2001, the problem is that when you go into the event, you don't know what you're facing. And as much as there is a prevalence of the level A biocontainment suits in many of the world's law enforcement offices, but particularly in places like New York City and Los Angeles, the practicality of getting a call and walking in full gear is just not practical. And so what should be intuitive, that the first responder would want this proactive protection, turns out to be counterintuitive, and that the firefighters don't want anything to do with it until they know that it's perfectly safe, that there's no side effects. And therefore, many of the unions are resisting this inoculation process. Many local governments don't understand the need to provide this to their first responders. And so, at least as to one threat, you have a solution. And yet, because of the time period and the low probability of this high-impact event, you don't have the motivation for the first responders to be vaccinated. Third example. Heard much about chemical weapons. And probably one of the most prevalent fatal chemicals from an inhalation perspective is chlorine. There was a collision in the South about 5 or 6 years ago where 2 tanker cars filled with chlorine hit into each other and ruptured. There was a resulting plume, and 5 people died, less than 100 people were injured. This is pointed to as the reason why this type of material should not be easily transported across the rail lines of the United States. Yet, it is a chemical that is used in a great number of manufacturing processes. When you take a look at the actual event, what you find is that if the first responders had been properly trained in how to approach this hazardous material incident, that the loss of life and the injuries would have been greatly reduced. But yet, this drives many in Congress to look at the transportation of this hazardous material as being something that should be restricted, if not possibly eliminated in some way, shape, or form. Again, we have a solution: better training for all first responders. Certainly people who are around the rail lines, and yet that's not the path, or that's not a part of the debate that's being discussed now in Congress. So, what do you do? And how should you approach government? How can you provide value? And so that's the first thing I would say, that what many of the local governments and state governments lack is that understanding of what their problems are. And the private sector can do so much in terms of understanding and bringing forth information. Try to close that delta. Try to add value to the discussion. The other thing that I think you have to consider doing if you're going to be in this market, and it is a multi-billion-dollar market, is try to change the dynamic. Don't do what so many people did to me. Here, Secretary Balboni, here's a widget. Buy it. It's the best of its kind. That doesn't work. What works instead is if you came to me and you said, I have a system which is green security. You can do building perimeter protection system that actually saves energy. So when the worker comes to the door off hours and uses a biometric, either a retinal scan, a thumbprint, facial imaging, that the computer recognizes it and works with the smart building concept, and now only activates the doors that that person is permitted to go to, and only activates the HVAC for that particular place. Also works within the smart building concept of heat radiation and keeping the level of the building constant preventing the spikes, while using the cameras to prevent the intrusion of a perimeter and notification of responding law enforcement. That little piece on security, you could actually say that you could save money, will be enormously, enormously advantageous to the discussion. We must develop systems that are just-in-time emergency responses. Right after 9/11, we were told we had to prepare the state, and we were given dollars to go and do that. Well, how do you do that? What do you buy for people? What we did was we bought these very large containers, and we filled them with Level A suits, Mark IV chemical response kits, tranquilizers, bedding, all sorts of different materials, and we delivered them to municipalities around the state. Well, then we were applauded by the Department of Homeland Security as being innovative and dispersing the material in a way that made sense. Well, now it's 9 years later. Many of the items that are in that container now either have gone bad or people who were trained on them once have moved on. And so it's not sustainable. We have a just-in-time economy in this world, and we rely on it to get us the things when we need them. Well, why can't we do that with emergency response as well? And the last is we must take the information, the data, and the video streams and make it not just forensic, but preventative. We must use the video systems, first of all, keeping in mind civil rights and the protection of personal identities, but also the ability to provide an advantage to law enforcement prior to the event. Easier said than done. What it really means is to do a very good facial matching list, which is difficult in its own rights, but that is the evolution of a technology that needs to happen. So where does this leave us? This leaves us with the acknowledgement of the fact that in many respects we have failed in our mission to protect the entire country of the United States through massive infusions of dollars. We have also failed in bridging the gap between the private sector innovation and the public sector need. I think what we should do is get into the nuts and bolts and try to understand more of who we're talking to. Because, ladies and gentlemen, if we don't try to bridge that gap and that appreciation, we will never get government to take off their hard hats. Thank you very much.